Welcome back, everyone, to another deep dive. This time, we're going to tackle a number that I think a lot of people have opinions about, maybe without even realizing it.
hmm
The number 13. We got a ton of listener research on this one, which we always love. So yeah, should be interesting to see what we find.
Yeah, for sure. We're going to be looking at it from all angles: Western superstition, Hindu morning rituals, even how it seems to be just totally absent in Islam.
I've always been fascinated by the cultural baggage that comes with certain numbers.
Oh, yeah.
Like, honestly, how many times have you walked into a building that just skips right over the 13th floor?
Oh, absolutely. It's really striking how deep-rooted that fear of 13, or triskaidekaphobia, as it's technically called, really is.
Yeah, triskaidekaphobia.
Yeah, it's not just about avoiding the number itself, but it's this whole underlying sense of dread, like it's a bad omen.
Okay, so where does this fear even come from? Is it just because it comes after 12, which seems to be like this perfect number? 12 months, 12 apostles, 12 zodiac signs.
Right.
It's like 13 breaks the pattern.
There are a bunch of theories out there,
Yeah.
but one of the most common ones points back to the Last Supper,
Oh,
where there were 13 people present, including Judas, who, as you know, ended up betraying Jesus.
oh, right, right.
So from a very early point, 13 gets this association with betrayal and with misfortune.
It makes you wonder if that story hadn't existed, would 13 still have this negative connotation today? Or is it like completely because of that? But it's interesting, though, this fear seems to be way more prominent in like Western cultures.
Yeah, that's true.
I mean, are there any similar superstitions in other parts of the world?
Oh, absolutely. In some East Asian cultures, the number 4 is considered unlucky.
Oh, four.
Yeah, because it sounds similar to the word for death.
Oh, whoa, okay.
But going back to the West, it's not just biblical stories that feed into this fear of 13. We got to look at Norse mythology, too.
Oh, yeah, Loki. The trickster god, he crashed a dinner party, right? With
Yeah.
12 gods. So he was like the super unwelcome 13th guest.
Exactly. Yeah. And of course, it didn't end well. Loki being there led to the death of Balder, who was a beloved god.
So it's that same theme. The 13th guest brings chaos and bad luck.
Exactly. Yeah, it's a recurring motif. And it seems like even real-life historical events have played a role in cementing 13's bad rep.
Wait, are you talking about Friday the 13th?
That's right.
I know it's a huge deal in some cultures, but what actually happened? What historical event made it stick?
One that really stands out is the arrest of the Knights Templar.
Oh, wow.
It happened on Friday, October 13th, in the year 1307.
Get out. Talk about a bad day.
Yeah, King Philip V of France accused these knights, who were super powerful at the time of heresy,
Mhm.
and had them all arrested.
I mean, that's got to be just fuel for the fire for anybody who's already superstitious about the number 13. Right?
Oh, absolutely. That event, plus all the existing superstitions, really cemented that date and the number 13 in general as a symbol of bad luck.
It's almost like a self-fulfilling prophecy. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
If everyone's expecting bad things to happen on Friday the 13th, they're going to be more likely to notice any negative event that does happen, and that just feeds back into the superstition.
Exactly. It's like a feedback loop of perception and confirmation bias.
Confirmation bias, yeah.
But this is where things get really interesting.
Uh.
Because in Hinduism, 13 isn't seen as unlucky at all.
It's almost the opposite, right? Like, it's spiritual, it's tied to the afterlife. It's so wild how different these perspectives are. So what's the deal with 13 in Hinduism?
So in Hinduism, 13 is closely connected with death and the soul's journey. When someone dies, there's a 13-day mourning period where the family members abstain from certain things, like cutting their hair or shaving.
It's seen as a way to honor the deceased, right?
Exactly. It's about honoring the deceased, and it allows time for the soul to transition to the afterlife.
So instead of fearing 13, they're embracing it as part of this whole spiritual process.
Yeah,
I
exactly.
remember reading about a specific ritual that happens on the 13th day.
Oh, you're thinking of Shraddha, sometimes called Theravin.
Shraddha, yeah.
It's a ceremony where offerings are made to the ancestors, and they say prayers for the deceased soul to reach a higher realm.
Wow, that sounds really beautiful and meaningful.
It is.
Is there like a philosophical reason why they chose 13 for this transition period?
Well, Hinduism is all about the cycle of reincarnation, right? They believe that the soul goes through multiple lifetimes, learning and evolving along the way.
Okay.
So this 13-day period and the Shraddha ritual are seen as super important steps for the soul.
Like it helps them move on.
Exactly. It helps them detach from the past life and get ready for the next journey.
It's not just about honoring the dead, it's about ensuring a smooth transition for their soul.
Exactly. And that's a completely different perspective on 13 compared to what we see in the West.
Night and day. So we have fear and reverence for the same number, just depends on where you are in the world.
And it's actually not just Hinduism. Other Eastern religions with roots in India, Buddhism, Jainism, and Sikhism, they have their own unique rituals and beliefs around death and the afterlife too.
We should definitely dig into those.
Yeah, for sure.
I'm always blown away by how differently cultures approach these big universal experiences.
Me too.
Before we jump into those other Eastern religions, is there anything else interesting about 13 and Hinduism that we haven't touched on?
Well, there are some Hindu scriptures that associate 13 with specific deities or cosmic events.
Ooh,
But
okay.
those are more esoteric interpretations.
Yeah.
They're not as widely known or practiced as the rituals surrounding death.
So it's probably best to understand those core beliefs first, right?
I think so.
And then we can always circle back to the more, I guess, niche interpretations.
Exactly.
Okay, so what about you? Anything in particular that stands out to you so far from what we've covered?
Honestly, it's just that contrast between fear and reverence that blows my mind. In the West, 13 is like anxiety-inducing, suspicious, right?
Yeah.
But in Hinduism, it's a sacred number. It's about spiritual growth and the soul's journey.
Such different vibes.
It just shows how our cultural and religious frameworks shape our worldview, even down to how we see something as basic as a number.
It really does. It makes you wonder what other seemingly ordinary things hold completely different meanings in different cultures.
Right. This is why these deep dives are so cool.
I know, right? Always learning.
It's a good reminder that our own view of the world is just one of many.
Perfectly said. All right, so we've talked about the Western fear of 13. We've explored the spiritual significance of it in Hinduism. Now let's shift gears and explore those related Eastern religions like Buddhism, Jainism, and Sikhism. How do they view 13? What's its role, if any, in their beliefs and practices?
Good question.
So we've explored this Western apprehension around 13 and how it's almost the complete opposite in Hinduism, where it's the spiritual thing. Now I'm curious about these other Eastern religions, especially the ones with roots in India, like Buddhism, Jainism, Sikhism.
Right.
Do they have similar ideas about death and the afterlife?
It's interesting. They may not focus on the number 13 itself, but they do have this shared core concept with Hinduism. The soul's journey after death and the cycle of rebirth.
So it's not so much about the actual number, but more about the whole bigger picture of death?
Yeah, exactly. It really shows how, even though the practices might be different, the basic understanding of what it means to be human, that can be really similar.
That's a good point.
Take Buddhism, for example. They have a bunch of different rituals and practices after death, but the specifics, those often depend on the branch of Buddhism or the culture.
Yeah.
It's not a one-size-fits-all kind of thing.
I remember reading about this practice in Tibetan Buddhism called sky burial.
Oh, yeah.
It's where they leave the body exposed to the elements and vultures.
Pretty intense imagery.
Yeah, super intense.
But it's directly tied to their beliefs about impermanence and the cycle of rebirth.
It's like a really physical way of showing the body returning to nature.
Exactly.
Powerful stuff. So Buddhism has its own way of approaching these death rituals. What about Jainism?
Okay, so Jainism puts a huge emphasis on this cycle of birth, death, and rebirth.
Okay.
But their approach is all about ahimsa.
Ahimsa.
Yeah, it means nonviolence
Oh, right.
in any form.
Got it.
And they extend that to how they treat the deceased.
So how does that actually play out in their rituals?
Their rituals are generally known for being really simple.
Mm-hmm.
Cremation is common, and prayers are focused on helping the soul achieve liberation from this cycle of rebirth.
It sounds very peaceful.
It is very peaceful and compassionate.
What about Sikhism? What do they believe happens after death?
So Sikhism is all about living an ethical life and remembering God all the time. Their death rituals often involve reciting hymns and prayers continuously, and again, the focus is on that soul's journey and its ultimate union with the divine.
So even though the number 13 might not be specifically important in these Eastern religions, they all have these rituals and practices that are meant to help guide the soul after death.
Yeah, and I think that just shows a really universal human need. No matter your culture or religion, we all deal with death.
Right.
And we're trying to find ways to understand it, to make sense of it, to find comfort and meaning when we lose someone.
Such a good point. It really puts things in perspective. Okay, so we've covered fearing 13 in the West, respecting it in Hinduism and other Eastern religions, but what about Islam? Why doesn't 13 seem to matter as much there?
Right. That's interesting.
It's like it doesn't have the same weight at all.
From what we've gathered, 13 doesn't really have any superstitious or spiritual meaning in mainstream Islam.
Okay.
There aren't widespread beliefs or practices specifically tied to it.
But I did see something about the Bismillah, the opening phrase in the Quran, having 13 letters.
Oh, right.
Could that be significant?
Some people do point to that as a potential numerological thing.
Mm.
But it's important to say that's a pretty esoteric interpretation.
So not really mainstream.
Exactly. Not something that most Muslims would consider part of their everyday beliefs.
Got it. So it's more of a fringe idea.
Yeah, I'd say so.
Okay, that makes sense. Islam seems to focus more on the big concepts, right?
Yeah, like faith, submitting to God, living a righteous life.
Makes sense.
Specific numerology doesn't play a big part.
Okay, so we've gone from fear in the West to spiritual importance in Hinduism and related Eastern religions to basically neutral in Islam.
Yeah, it's pretty wild.
It's amazing how one number can have such different meanings depending on where you are and what you believe.
I know. It really highlights how much our backgrounds, our cultures, our religions, how much they influence how we see the world,
It's true.
even when it comes to something as simple as a number.
Totally. It's a reminder that there are so many different ways of seeing and understanding things.
F-
All right, before we wrap up with our final thoughts, what's standing out to you from everything we've talked about? Any surprises or connections you've made?
You know, it's really hitting me how much we've learned about cultural perceptions just by talking about the number 13.
Yeah,
It's like this one number can tell you so much about a whole set of beliefs and traditions.
totally. We often just accept these meanings without really thinking about where they come from,
And what's wild is how these interpretations, even though they seem like total opposites, might actually share a common theme.
Mm.
We talked about 13 being a symbol of disruption in the West and a representation of transition in Hinduism.
Right.
Maybe it's not about good or bad luck, but
Yeah.
more about change itself in the unknown.
Whoa, that's a really interesting thought.
Like 13 forces us to face the idea of the unknown, and that can be kind of scary, but also really fascinating.
For sure.
It makes me wonder, are there other numbers out there that have these hidden meanings? Numbers we see all the time but don't realize the cultural weight they might carry. Ooh, that's a great question. I bet there are tons. Think about 7, for example.
Okay, 7.
It pops up everywhere. 7 days of creation, 7 deadly sins, the 7 chakras in Hinduism.
Oh, yeah.
Makes you wonder if there's some deeper universal significance to these numbers, something that crosses different belief systems.
It's like we've only just started to explore this whole world of numerical symbolism.
Right. There's so much more to uncover.
And this is where you come in, dear listener.
Yeah.
We've spent this deep dive figuring out the many faces of 13, but now it's your turn to explore.
Think about numbers that have a special meaning for you in your own life or culture.
Maybe it's a lucky number in your family, a number that keeps popping up at important moments, or even just a number that feels important to you for no real reason.
It could be anything. Do some digging, ask your family and friends about their experiences with numbers.
You never know what stories and traditions you might uncover, what hidden meanings are lurking beneath the surface of these everyday numbers.
Your discoveries could even inspire a future deep dive. Who knows?
So keep exploring, keep questioning, and most importantly, keep that curiosity alive.
Couldn't have said it better myself.
Thanks for joining us on this numerical adventure. We'll catch you next time on The Deep Dive.